Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever it is for you. For me, it is just past midnight on Thursday, September the 19th, 2024. That makes this the news for Wednesday, September 18th, 2024, day 939 of Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against the people of Ukraine. I'm Peter Alexievich, and this is the Live at 5 from Kyiv, coming to you live from Kyiv, Ukraine, with all the latest news and events happening on the ground. And I see the peeps are starting to come in. Hey, PT. Hey, Wind. Hey, Trash Hunter. PH and Darlene are here. Hey, Bjorn, thank you. Guys, the gifts are great. It's fun. I appreciate it. But it is not as good as a subscription or joining the Patreon. I think last night, all the hearts, all the yada yadas, whatever, totaled 83 cents. Hey, Steve Kennedy. Hey, Esteban. Hey, Marilyn Fuller. Nice to see you. Thanks, Sassy Taco. Appreciate it. Hey, Ant. What's up, Nightshade? So, ladies and gentlemen, another non-binary folks, welcome to another Live at 5 from Kyiv. I'm Peter Alexievich, and we'll start with last night's missile and drone attacks. Territorial Defense said it shot down 46 of 52 Shaheds. There were also 3 Kh-59s that were fired at the territory of the Ukraine. Civilian casualties were reported in Sumy, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, all over the country last night. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, shot a bunch of drones at the territory of the Russian Federation. The Russians claim to have shot down 54 drones, 27 in Kursk, 7 in Smolensk, 1 in Oriel, 3 in Belgorod. Now, curiously enough, they did not claim that they shot down any in Tver. And clearly, there were lots of drones fired at Tver. According to the governor of Tver, drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, came in at the territory of the 107th GRAU Arsenal. Now, the GRAU Arsenal is a giant facility for storing ammunition and missiles. This thing features lots of hardened concrete underground bunkers. In 2018, at the ribbon cutting ceremony, the deputy defense minister for the Russian Federation said that this would protect our munitions from any attack by foreign influence or any of our enemies, right? Something to that effect. Dig it. We did not know until just this afternoon in listening to an interview with Michael Bonert from the Rand Corporation. He said, and this is not a guy who overstates things. He's very cautious. Everything he says is always couched in careful language with all the caveats. He is not a person who overstates things. But he said very clearly, very confidently, as if he knew for sure, that the Russians had left missiles and ammunition out in the open. So they spent tens of millions of dollars to build these hardened concrete bunkers and warehouses to securely store the ammunition and missiles, and then right outside of them, in the same facility, they just left a bunch of shit piled up. And that is what the drones hit. That is what the drones got exploding. And that is what led to what is reported to have been a 2.8 earthquake-like tremor that was recorded by local seismologists. 2.8 on the Richter scale. from the explosion and the secondary explosions at the, the Terrapets in Tver facility. Again, that's the 107th GRAU Arsenal. This thing traditionally stored MLRS Grad rockets, 152 and 82 millimeter shells, and 762 ammunition. But the experts today seem to agree that there was also stored there North Korean KN-23-24 missiles. So some of the missiles that the Russians got from the North Koreans are up in smoke. We do not know if there were any Iranian missiles there. But in addition to the Korean missiles, reports are suggesting that there was S-300 missiles present and Iskander missiles as well. The governor of Tver was hysterical on this subject. He came out, he gave an interview where he said that there were drones attacked. The drones were all shot down, though again, they were not included in the official number of shot down drones. And the debris from the drones landed on the territory of the arsenal and started a fire. So once again, the Ukrainians failed to hit the target, but the debris from their drones managed to hit the target and blow the thing up. The kaboom was so big, the fire so huge. The NASA firm's data has it at about 5 square kilometers. The entire facility appears to be burning and is still burning now, with additional cook-offs still happening now, almost 24 hours after the fact. This is the third such storehouse of ammunition that the Ukrainians have hit, the biggest of the lot yet. No doubt. I don't think there's any doubt about that. This is the biggest and most significant hit so far. So much so that the cook-off from this was literally visible from space. We have satellite pictures showing where the plume of smoke is quite clearly obvious. Now, this is the third of these. There was the one in Voronezh. There was the one in Mariupol. And now this one in Tver. These are huge hits. The one in Voronezh, they said, took out 700 glide bombs alone. Huge hit. So look, for anybody who is speculating that this hit was storm shadows or because these are concrete bunkers, it was not. The facility was outside of storm shadow range. People in the know, people who have a reason to know, are saying that very clearly they left missiles and ammunition out in the open. The drones hit those missiles and ammunition that were out in the open. That caused a chain reaction where bunkers got blown, and the contents of those bunkers then were secondary explosions. And that resulted in the seismologist registering a 2.8 earthquake on the Richter scale. So the governor of Tver comes out and he says, everything is fine. Everything is under control. Some drone debris has caused a fire. 2 hours later, he was out there evacuating the local residents. So nothing says everything is going according to plan, like having to evacuate the residents from your secure munitions storage facility. I mean, really. Local officials were quick to get onto social media and tell the locals not to post pictures, right? Like, this was their priority. Don't post pictures, don't post video of the facility. Again, the NASA firm satellite data showed 5 square kilometers up in smoke. My favorite part of this is that the local Tver Oblast website was hacked, clearly by the Ukrainians. And the load page, the first page when you went there, was a picture of General Budanov, head of the Military Intelligence Directorate of Ukraine, and his biography. It's hysterical. Now, we can ask the question, and it's a fair question to ask. What is air defense doing? How is it possible that these drones are getting in there? And in an interview with the London Telegraph, Michael Bonert, who's an engineer with the Rand Corporation and an expert in these affairs, gave a wonderful history lesson of the development of Russian air defense. That principally it was built to defend against the U.S., against high-flying bombers, high-altitude jets, fighter jets, and fast-moving cruise and ballistic missiles, as well as ICBMs. It was not designed, nor did it anticipate targets as small as these drones. And so the Russians simply don't have the short-range, low-altitude, small target air defense systems like the Gepards that the Ukrainians use so effectively to battle the drones here in Ukraine. They simply don't have the systems for them. And they're not, frankly, in a position to develop them right now. They are stretched so far to the limit that developing new incentives, new product lines, new defensive capabilities appear to be quite out of reach for the Russians at this time. So that is the latest and greatest on Terrapets and the arsenal that blew up and the arsenal that was targeted last night and that is still burning now, nearly 24 hours later. It is worth mentioning, we said this is the third of these in 2 weeks, right? There was the Voronezh and the Mariupol ammo dumps that went up as well, or more appropriately, ammo storage and staging areas, because these were scaled multi-acre storage facilities. The Ukrainian Navy is taking credit for hitting the Mariupol storage facility last week. They say they hit it with a Neptune bomb, with a Neptune missile. So the Neptune missile, the Neptunes are domestically produced Ukrainian ship-to-ship missiles that have been re-engineered for air-to-ground or ground-to-ground use. And that seems to have been very effective over Mariupol. In today's edition of Russia on Fire, it's not just the Tver region, but in Yaroslav, Russia, there is a fuel and lubricants warehouse that is up in flames today. We don't know why. The cause of that fire is unclear. Finland has called for the removal of Russia from the UN Security Council and an expansion of the Security Council to include representatives of Asia and Africa. Now, the reality of this problem with the UN Security Council is that the permanent members and their veto powers are written into the charter. And there are a lot of difficulties with amending the UN charter. So it does occur to me that when Russia is defeated by the Ukrainians, and only the Ukrainians can set the terms of Russian surrender, as I keep saying, the rest of us in the world ought to be thinking about what we need to get out of Russia in order to bring them back into the world community, right? To lift sanctions and restore normalcy and normal relationships with them. And it occurs to me that where the rest of the world has some leverage is with this question of the UN Charter, rewriting the UN Charter, removing Russia from the Security Council where clearly they must be removed from, and denuclearization, right? If Russia, right, we need to move the whole Overton window on what is acceptable in the world dealing with Russia and what we're going to be willing to let them get away with. We have to move that whole Overton window so that we are talking about denuclearization, because anybody that will use nuclear blackmail on the rest of us cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons. It's just that simple. They gotta be denuclearized. The denuclearization of Russia and the removal of Russia from the Security Council should be the concern of the rest of the civilized world as Russia winds down its own devolution, which is exactly what's happening, right? We're watching the Russian society devolve. Today, I forget where, I want to say Samara, but I could be wrong. There's a hospital where the elevators don't work anymore, and they have to walk patients down the stairs or carry them down the stairs because they can't get parts for the elevators. And right, Otis. You get into an elevator in Kyiv, guess who made it? Otis. Otis Elevator. American elevators everywhere you look here. Under sanctions. They can't get the parts. The Russians are being forced to take the stairs because they can't get elevator parts. Increasingly, flights are being canceled and airplanes grounded because they can't get the parts for the planes. They're cannibalizing every plane that they can just to keep the ones that can still fly flying. We're seeing the devolution of a society here. One of the things that we do not talk about, but that increasingly I see coming up, kind of haunting news stories coming out of Russia in the background, are increased failures of the power grid, having nothing to do with the Ukrainians, right? The Ukrainians aren't targeting the civilian power grid in Russia. Instead, what's happening is that the Russians don't have the money or the parts to replace and repair the power grid. And so as the power grid continues to fail, we are increasingly seeing brownouts and rolling blackouts from the far east all the way to the western part of the country. Only the big city centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg seem to have been unaffected. But increasingly, like a shadow in the background of so many of the stories coming out of Russia, we're seeing hints that the power grid is failing and the Russians don't have the resources to repair it and keep it running. The very thing that they tried to inflict on the Ukrainians, that they spent so much money, energy, and lives trying to destroy, their failures in this war and at home are having the same impact through their casual neglect. It's insanity. It's absolute insanity. Now, on the subject of participation in the world, the rules-based world order, which Russia has completely thumbed its nose at in its choice of genocide in Ukraine, the IMF will not renew its mission to Moscow. And so one of the things that the Ukrainians are quite fortunate to have is the support of the world. That means that when their debt needed to be restructured with the IMF, a restructuring plan was possible, freeing up more money to keep the civil society of Ukraine functioning. Russia doesn't have that. And they are desperately trying to raise capital. The Russian bond market is in the toilet. Nobody's interested in buying Russian bonds. People who don't understand debt instruments, they often talk about, oh, we owe so much money to the Chinese. Oh, we owe so much money to the Japanese. You don't understand bonds. You don't understand debt instruments. We, in the United States, want to raise money. We sell bonds. Governments who want to protect their money, inflation-proof their money, and make more money buy those bonds, those debt instruments become a way of raising capital in the short term, but generating long-term wealth. The United States has the greatest system for generating wealth that the world has ever seen. It is just that simple. The record of the 20th century demonstrates that to be true. The Russians don't have a clue, and now they don't have the IMF either. That's going to be a problem as they increasingly are not liquid. Their liquidity, the sovereign wealth fund only has so many liquid assets in it. Those assets are being consumed at a rate of about $4.4 billion a month. That gives the Russians maybe another 8 months, maybe. Now, there are other non-liquid assets in the sovereign wealth fund, like gold, but the Russians are using that gold for all their international trade, and it is quickly being depleted. Then there are other long-term assets in there related to the energy sector that if Russia has to liquidate, is going to be a problem because there are no buyers for them. So the IMF is out. That brings Russia one step closer to its inevitable bankruptcy. There is a reason why the new defense minister of the Russian Federation, I feel pretty, is an economist. There's a reason, because Putin knows he's bankrupting the country, and he's desperate for this economist to fix it for him. Ain't gonna happen. Ain't gonna happen. Not at this rate. This is all unsustainable. The Swiss, the notoriously neutral Swiss, there in their big hollowed out country with their watches and their chocolate and their guns, they will hold the Ukraine Mine Action Conference October 17th and 18th. So this is a Swiss initiative to bring together all those folks out there that are trying to deal with the contamination of mines. I was fortunate to meet Paul Smith, who is the director of the Halo Trust here in Ukraine. He right now has 2,500 Ukrainians out in the field demining Ukraine. It is estimated that the land is contaminated with between 2 and 3 million landmines, anti-personnel and anti-tank mines mostly. Beyond that, there is an untold number of unexploded munitions. Everything from the unexploded bomblets of cluster munitions to unexploded missiles just sitting there needing to be diffused. This country, like Vietnam, you're not wrong, Dark Irish, right? And one of the points where the U.S. is still spending money in Vietnam is in demining the country. 40 years later, pal. Almost 50 years later since we pulled out. We are still demining Vietnam. Vietnamese children are still losing fingers and hands and feet to unexploded ordnance in the country. Not like they were 30 years ago, but they still are. The future, the next generation of Ukraine's children, if their parents want them to be able to play securely and run through the fields here, we're going to have to pay attention to this question of demining and cleaning up this contamination. And that's what this Swiss conference will draw attention to. Facebook and Meta. Zuckerberg is finally doing something right. He is making the distinction between freedom of speech and rampant, unrestricted, corrosive disinformation intended to deceive, lies, Russian disinformation. Now look, this is not a partisan statement. This is not my biasy. It's a fact. The stories that come out of the Russian media are bullshit. They are factually inaccurate. They are misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation designed to create chaos and sow division inside of Western society. We must have the courage and the strength to recognize the distinction between freedom of speech and a difference of opinion and the corrosive disinformation and lies of our enemies that are designed to persuade us of that which is not true. Ask everybody in Springfield, Ohio, what how violent these kinds of lies can quickly become. City Hall had to be evacuated twice because of bomb threats this week in Springfield, Ohio, because of the lies that Tangerine Palpatine repeated from his idiot stepson, J.D. Vance, in the debate with Kamala Harris. Racist tropes of the worst sort. So Facebook and Meta are banning RT, Russian television, from their platforms, as well as some other Russian media / propagandist outfits. Mark Barros from the ISW gave a great interview to Times Radio today, and I would encourage everybody to watch it. I think most of the folks that follow this channel will be aware of most of what he was talking about. But he did talk for a while about one thing that was very interesting and off the normal conversation that we have. You know, very often on this channel, we talk about, oh, when are the Russian people going to stand up to this? When are the Russian people going to revolt? How much can the Russians take? Oh, sorry, Bobby. It is George Barros. My apologies. My apologies to Mr. Barros. Thank you, Bobby. So we often talk about, like, how much more can the Russians take? When will the Russians revolt? Why don't they revolt? And this is what we get wrong about the Russians. The vast majority of the Russian people support this war and believe that Russia is winning and cannot lose. And if you doubt that, take a look at some of the latest installments of the 1420 project or 1410 project. It's a Russian kid who does interviews on the street with Russians. And his most recent videos are all about when will we win the war, or will we win the war, the special military operation. And virtually to a person, the Russians that respond are all rah-rah. It's very eye-opening. Meanwhile, they're wearing Budweiser hats. It's hysterical. I mean, these people have no sense of irony at all. But Mr. Barros talked today about the veterans that are coming home from the war. And in his estimation, there are so many wounded vets coming home from the war that they create essentially a new point of political cleavage that could be divisive. So what does Russia do? Russia gives these vets places in the political hierarchy, gives them power to affect local ordinances, local laws, local budgets, gives them salaries and positions of authority. So there is an effort, and he points out that this is very smart, right? You take what could be a disaffected political group that could force change on the society, you take them, and instead of letting them do that, you integrate them into the political structure. You make them part of the ruling class. And that's exactly what is happening with these veterans. And so we're not going to see any disabled veterans group rise up and challenge the Kremlin, challenge Putin, challenge the process of the war, because they're being integrated into the political hierarchy. They're being rewarded for their sacrifices. And that creates and again, remember, these people all live in an artificial information bubble where the only story, the only perspective is the story and the perspective of the Kremlin in the context of Russian history. That is a tough row to hoe, baby. That is a tough world to inject anything like another perspective, a foreign perspective, which, by the way, are universally suspect inside of Russia. It's impossible to inject facts into because these people are fact-proof. They've been made fact-proof by a regime that doesn't believe there is any such thing as objective truth and spends so much time lying that no one inside the country gives a fuck anymore about what the truth is because they don't believe truth even exists. And if it does, they can't know it. That is a very different world to live in than the world that we live in, where we can entertain ideas without necessarily ascribing to them. That luxury does not exist for the Russian people. I think it's, somebody tell me if I'm wrong, it's the 1420 project, right? That Russian kid has on YouTube. I'm pretty sure it's 1420. In that most recent video of his, there is one girl who says, one young woman who says, I don't want to answer these questions because I might say something wrong. Because having the wrong opinion in Russia can end you in a gulag. That's the kind of world that the Russians live in, a world that we can't even fathom. It is so different from what we are used to. Now, I want to call this out. There's a lot of discussion, of course, we're having a lot of discussion in the West about the use of Western weapons for long-range strikes inside of Russia. Everybody that follows this channel knows that I believe that we should take the gloves off, let the Ukrainians, give the Ukrainians what they need to win, and then support them in the win. That's my opinion. The discussion of long-range strikes inside of Russia with Western weapons is already having an effect on Russian behavior. The Russians have now moved 95% of the aircraft that were within range of ATACMS strikes, as well as all of the warships in Novorossiysk out of range. They're moving the equipment. They're protecting it. The thing is, with the planes at least, the planes are what they do all their glide bomb runs with, right? So moving the planes back another 300 kilometers out of ATACMS and Storm Shadow range means that the Russians can fly fewer sorties. That's just simple math, right? If you got to fly an extra 600 miles on every round trip, it's going to take longer. You can fly fewer of them. This has resulted in a drop of 33% in glide bomb attacks inside of Ukraine. That's a big deal. They have dropped from 180 a day to 120. Now, that's still way too many. It's still terrorizing the population. They're still leveling Ukrainian cities with these. But just the discussion of granting long-range strike capability authorization to the Ukrainians has forced this change. Could you imagine if the Ukrainians could actually make the strikes, the changes that it would affect in the Russia's ability to prosecute the war? Huge, huge. Okay. So, guys, I want to thank Beatrice Sella, who is the sponsor of tonight's live. I want to thank the best moderator team on the Tickety Talk, Cheyenne, Vanetta, PT, Jay, and Travis. Thank you guys for all your constancy and hard work. Big thanks to Nightshade, who has the Peter's Peeps public group on the Book of Faces, where these videos get reposted after the live. If you ever miss one, you can pick it up there, or on the TubeViews. And big thanks to Lars, who has the Discord server and the Alexievich archive. And big thanks to Vanetta, who has the Google Docs share and the Dismantled Project 2025 group on the Book of Faces. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, those are my top line stories for the day. Questions, comments, points of observation, or personal need. The video of the Tavir ammo storage facility blowing up is something that everybody should Google. I mean, it's unbelievable. These fireballs, these mushroom cloud fireballs, are going 500 feet, right? Like 200 meters in the air. It looks like Armageddon. It's not surprising that this shit registered. They're all over TikTok, Dark Irish, right? 2.8 is what I'm hearing, Steve. 2.8 on the Richter scale. It did look like an atomic bomb, didn't it, Bobby? And then when that initial, like, mushroom cloud goes up, all of a sudden then you see another one over here and another one over there. Clearly, the munitions that were left out in the open clearly broke open some of those bunkers. Now, how many bunkers, what was in them, we don't know. Blue Ariel Silk, I don't know anything about that. So Blue Ariel Silk is saying, did we talk about the Russian ship full of fertilizer off of Norway? It lost steering. Is it true? I don't know anything about that. However, I can tell you that maybe, oh gosh, I want to say a year to 18 months ago, the exact same thing happened. Right? Like, I don't know if this is something you just saw from 18 months ago, or if it's just the Russians lying again. Now, look, the Russians do a lot of fertilizer business. That was what was in the ship. You remember there was some disinformation that went out, about 8 months ago, about how the U.S. Navy was buying Russian oil on the side. It was bullshit. The Russian Navy, or I'm sorry, the U.S. Navy was buying urine fertilizer, liquid fertilizer. And that's because it's used in the bunker fuel that drives most naval ships. So the Russians sell a lot of fertilizer. But of course, fertilizer can also be used as a precursor for explosions, the right kind of fertilizer. Okay, let me see here. So, Blue Ariel Silk, you're saying you saw the story today, so you think that it's current. So that's just tracks. That just tracks with behavior that we've seen from the Russians before. The New Yorker, for anybody who's interested in 30,000-word articles, the New Yorker this week has a great article about Russia's Arctic war and how the Russians are targeting Norway and the energy infrastructure in Norway and other energy sources above the Arctic Circle. And I have not read the whole thing. I only read a summary of that article, so I don't have the details, but I'm hoping to get to that article this week. Yeah, PT, I don't think... I mean, it's true. You can see it on the satellite images, right? And those satellite images are higher than the International Space Station. But I don't know that the guys on the ISS could actually see it. If it's man-made, it can be broken. Has a country ever gone bankrupt? And if so, what happens to the people? Oh, yeah, Dawn, lots of countries have gone bankrupt. Lots of countries. Now, we're living in an age, and the short answer to your question is, what happens is their currency gets wildly devaluated. And so a period of economic recession, extended poverty, or expansive poverty is generally the short-term result. We're living in a world today where the IMF generally intervenes to prop those nations and economies up. Now, that's a complex process, and the outcome has been different every time. Some of these would be Argentina is a great example of a country that's gone bankrupt. Chile would be a great example of a country that's gone bankrupt. Who else out there has gone bankrupt recently? Oh, the Greeks. The Greeks had a lot of problems right before the EU and then dragged their financial problems into the EU. So that's a case study to look at as well. The ammo didn't explode. We have the best ammo. Venezuela. I don't know that Venezuela ever technically did go. No, I think you're right, Bobby. I think they did. I'd have to look it up. But that's another great example of an economy that is certainly on the verge of collapse through mismanagement. Walter, that may have been one of the things that hurt the Greeks so bad. I don't know the answer to that. Kyiv is great, Nicola. How long do you reckon the Russian economy has left before it collapses? Maybe 8 to 10 months, maybe. I mean, it looks like they only have the money to fund the war for another 5 or 6. And if oil prices drop a little bit more, that time frame could get shortened. You know, the Russian economy is so dependent on the price of oil. And if I am not mistaken, Urals crude, I don't know if somebody can get a quote on Urals crude today, but if I'm not mistaken, Urals crude is pushing down toward $60 a barrel, toward the price cap. It's been selling for more. You know, not everybody participates in the price caps. And that means that the Russians had been selling oil for as high as $85 a barrel recently, like within the last maybe 60 or 80 days. Do you think Ukraine will collapse economically even if it wins the war? I don't, Nicola. And the reason that I don't is because the $20 billion in debt that Ukraine currently has with its external partners was just restructured in a way that is favorable to all parties, that takes some of the pressure off of Ukraine. And there is a burgeoning consumer economy here, as well as an expansively burgeoning defense sector industry that is innovating weapons that after this war will be sought after by governments everywhere. So I think Ukraine's future is very bright. If I had any money at all, I would be buying real estate in Ukraine. Honestly, I really would be. Does Russia make a profit at $70 a barrel? Yes, they do. So to the best of my, so if you look at the Moscow Times article from, I want to say 2021, like October, I want to say it was October of 2021, front page of the Moscow Times, there was an analysis of the costs of extraction for Urals crude to the Russian Federation of between $42 and $45 a barrel. So the best understanding we have, the fixed cost of extracting a barrel of oil out of the ground for the Russians is $42 to $45, which is the highest in the world, right? Absolutely ridiculously high. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's the fixed cost. Now, the big problem that the Russians are having is that they can't pipe this oil. The pipeline, there's limited pipeline availability. So that means that now it has to go on ships. That adds $12 a barrel transportation cost. That means that the cost of shipping, right, using the gray fleet that the Russians have put together, the minimum cost of extraction and delivery of a barrel of oil for the Russians is 54 to 58? No, 57. Sorry, $54 to $57 a barrel. So at $60 a barrel, they're making $3. At $70 a barrel, they're making 13. Now they're selling over 1 million barrels a day. I think the last count I saw, I think if I'm not mistaken, it was 5.4 million. So at $13 a day, or $13 a barrel, times 5 million barrels a day, that's not $100 billion. That's like 65 billion a day. They used to be taking in 120 million a day. Blue Ariel Silk says 68.47 as of yesterday. That's in dollars, 64.32 in euros. Hey, Wanpa. So that means that they are making roughly $11 a barrel right now. About $11 a barrel. Just too much money for them to be making. So it is pushing down, right, to that magic number. Yeah, you're not wrong, Bobby. There could be a lot of money in that. Now, Dusty says that real estate in Lviv is blowing up to 4-fold since last year, which makes a lot of sense because you have 7 million people displaced in the country, all from the Far East, all fleeing the action. And, I guess kind of the natural animal instinct is, how far can I get away from the horror? And that would be Lviv. Doesn't Russia spend $300 million a day on their military? So, Bobby, that figure is an estimate of the cost of the war, that the Russians are spending about and this was done by an economist, I forget his name, Velenchuk, maybe? He just published these findings. I've been meaning to look at them. I hope to look at them tomorrow. But the short answer is, according to him, he believes the Russians are spending about $300 million a day. Now, what's important about that number, though, is that that's what they're actually spending. That's the real fixed cost of prosecuting this war. That does not include the cost of bridges that have to be replaced because they get blown up. It doesn't include the cost of the lost AN-50s at $350 million apiece. That doesn't include the cost of the Tu-22 bombers that have been lost. That doesn't include the cost of that Su-30 SM, $50 million last week. Doesn't include any of those costs. So the real cost to the Russian Federation for the prosecution of this war on some days could be $1.5 billion. I'm thinking of a day, if you remember, there was a day where the Ukrainians went all out, struck a bunch of air bases overnight. A couple of Tu-22 bombers were hit. Some other high-end stuff was hit. It was a total loss for the day of $1.2 billion in equipment. $1.2 billion in one night in equipment. I mean, what do you think the cost was of what got blowed up last night in Tver? How much money went up in smoke with all of those shells and North Korean missiles and their own missiles and their 7.62 ammo and their, right? How many billions of rubles evaporated in a wisp of ozone and the smell of gunpowder last night? God knows. God knows. Do you think that China will take back their land from Russia? Don't know. I would rather that they didn't. I would rather that the West collectively saw to it that the people who actually live there got a right to self-determination and independence of their own. Independence for the Irkutis, for the Yakutis, for the Kamchatkans. Independence for the native peoples that have always been there, that have been subjugated to Moscow for anywhere from 100 to 300 years. For all those peoples, I would hope that the 21st century will be a century of self-determination. So Yah is saying that someone is saying that the Iranian missiles were there. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. That would be so great. They just got 200 shiny new ballistic missiles from the Iranians. We know that they were delivered via the Caspian Sea. If some of them happen to be in this facility, and that's what we saw blow up, all the better. All the better. Yeah, Dive Hard, they can't replace those resources. What are they going to do? The engines for every helicopter are made in Ukraine. Maybe that's why we're not seeing so many helicopter runs, right? One of the problems that we had in Donetsk and in other areas of the front were the Ka-52 helicopters coming in and blowing everybody up, basically. We're not seeing those helicopter runs in Kursk the way that we have in other times in this war along other parts of the front. Is it because they don't have the pilots anymore? A lot of the pilots have been sent to meet their maker. Do they not have the helicopters? Do they not have the parts? Are they cannibalizing half the helicopter fleet to keep the other half running? Most likely they are. Most likely they are. So no, there's no replacing the AN-50s. There's no replacing the Tu-22s. There's no replacing the Tu-95s. That's not going to happen. They don't have the time or the resources to rebuild the submarine that was lost, to rebuild the Rapucha-class landing ships that they are so desperately in need of, and that are now artificial reef starter kits in the Black Sea. They don't have that capacity. No. It's not just, so you're right, it's not just the financial value. It's the irreplaceable nature of those things. Hago, that is a direct quote from Zelensky right there, pal. 14 new brigades with only 4 armed and ready to go. Zelensky claiming that he does not have a manpower problem. He has a supply problem, an equipment problem. That is his problem. Larry Kim says it's Stingers. I don't know what you're talking about, Larry. Were we talking about Stingers? Jake Furs wants to know, are there any new developments in the Pokrovsk direction or in Kursk? In Pokrovsk yesterday, the Russians launched, if I'm not mistaken, 28 assaults and gained no ground. No ground. So there's no advance in the Pokrovsk direction. South of Donetsk City, some areas have come into the gray zone, but the advances are nominal. They're not advances. They're just an expansion of the gray zone, really. In Kursk, it does appear that the bulk of the Russian forces south of the same river that were engaged in the eastern offensive are now on the verge of being encircled and taken into a pocket in a classic pincer or double envelopment move. This could be the largest single surrender of Russian troops, assuming that they don't fight to the death once they're encircled, that we have seen in this war. Up to 2,000 soldiers are thought to be in that pocket or about to be taken into the pocket. So the offensive, the Russian offensive that took back Snagost, appears to have collapsed. I'm of the opinion that it was not really an offensive at all, but rather it was a Ukrainian trap, because the Ukrainians could have stopped it easily by blowing that upstream bridge over the River Seine. They blew all the other bridges. Why wouldn't they blow the one bridge that leads to the one highway south of the Seine? They didn't blow that bridge. So when the Russians came across it, came down to Snagost, got on that highway, they just blew up everything on that highway. One troop concentration after another that never reached the contact line. So Kursk is going swimmingly, it would appear. Hago says, what about the 14 brigades Zelensky spoke of? Hago, I don't even know that they exist. Could this be an example of Ukrainian Maskirovka? The Ukrainians don't actually have enough men. They're actually struggling to fill the slots. So the president says, I have all these men, but I don't have enough equipment. The West is too slow delivering equipment, which we are. And we can't let guys, if you're an American, we can't let that $6 billion in aid expire in 2 weeks. We got to call our Congress people and the White House and say, get on the ball about that. So sorry, Hago, I diverged there for a second. But that's a real issue for Americans to be concerned about. Oh, also another thing, if you have not yet followed Trev the Trev, please follow Trev the Trev. I want to have him on here so that he can answer your questions about real-life combat in Chasiv Yar and Donetsk, because that's where he's been for the last 2 years. Some orc disinformation posts claim the Russians just beat Ukraine in Kursk. I'm betting, thank you, PT. That's the guy right there, Trev the Trev, guys. Follow him for me, please. This guy is a combat veteran of the International Legion. He's still active duty. So I shouldn't say veteran, but meaning he has a lot of experience. He was in Chasiv Yar, he was in Donetsk for months at the zero line. The U.S. is replenishing our stockpiles with new. Yes, we are. Which I don't understand how Americans don't get that. Like, we're saving tens of millions of dollars on munitions we don't have to decommission. The Ukrainians are using those munitions for what they were built for in 1986 when Reagan paid for them. And now we're getting all shiny new ones that are better and stronger and faster. Like, how is that not the smartest thing we could possibly do? Okay. Let's see. How much time we got? Oh, we don't. We're out of time. How about that? Okay. So, guys, any final thoughts, questions, comments, points of observation, or personal need? Anything from anybody about anything? Yeah, man. Sweet dreams, dive hard. Crimea at moment. Crimea at moment. I don't know what that means, but Crimea is being deserted by the Russians. The Russian command has officially given orders that service members who have family in Crimea should evacuate their families. The Black Sea Fleet has completely abandoned Sevastopol and now has abandoned Novorossiysk, which is in ATACMS range. There's just a tugboat, a frigate, or a corvette, I forget, and one Rapucha-class landing ship left, and they are parked in the civilian part of the Novorossiysk harbor. So just the talk of long-range weapons is changing Russian behavior, making life harder for them. Trev the Trev, Norton. Trev the Trev. This guy is a guy, he's brand new to TikTok, but he's an experienced veteran of the war in the International Legion on the front line for 2.5 years. Hego says Russian frontal collapse coming. So you may be right, pal. Not before mud season, but the systemic changes that will lead to a hollowed out front line that can collapse are happening right now. The Russians are pulling reserves from all up and down the line. Not guys that are actually in the fight, right? But the reserves. They're pulling them all up and down the line to go to Kursk. Then they're getting decimated in Kursk. This kind of pulling of the reserves is going to hollow out the Eastern Front and eventually could lead to a collapse. That is what the great hope is, I think. Now, how long that's going to take is another question. Again, thinking about how the Russians are integrating veterans into the political hierarchy goes to the point that the Russians do live in a kind of bubble all their own. And they believe lots of things that are not true, but they believe them. And that gives them a certain perspective. And they see themselves as part of that vast Russian machine. That's a very special world to live in. And it is hard to penetrate. Those Dragonfire drones are not going to help the Russian army maintain its position. That is for sure. Belarus is seldom mentioned. If Ukraine reach Klinsky from Kursk, do you think it threatens them? Belarus is no threat to anybody. Belarus barely has 60,000 men in their army, and that's not accurate. Actual fighting infantry is only about 25,000. And they are poorly trained and poorly equipped. Lukashenko needs them at home to suppress they're bullies that keep the people down to keep Lukashenko in power. If he loses them, which he will in a contest with the Ukrainians, he's done. So Belarus is just a distraction. Don't pay any attention to anything the Belarusians do. They do not matter. They are completely inconsequential, which is why they seldom get mentioned. They just get mentioned when Uncle Luca does some bullshit, and we all go, oh, there goes Uncle Luca again. Last dictator in Europe. Oh, I'm sure those drones are a blow to Russian frontline morale. There's no morals there, PT, just morale. Nightshade says they geolocated where that POW was murdered with a sword. And they did. I incorrectly reported last night that it was Kherson. It was, in fact, in Donetsk. It was somewhere in Donetsk, part of the Pokrovsk advance. So this is a guy who was taken for defending Pokrovsk. F1, I gotta just, sorry. All right, the live's over anyway. All right, kids, thanks for hanging out. I sure do appreciate it. Thanks for being there for me. Because you are there for me, I can be here for you. If you have not joined the Patreon, I sure could use some Patreon supporters. I lost 4 Patreon supporters last month. If you want to sponsor a live, the PayPal is in the description. Shoot me a note with your TikTok handle, and you will be a live sponsor like Beatricella was today. Thank you, Cynthia. And like Bobby was yesterday. Thank you, Bobby. All right, thanks, guys. Make it a great day.